Hold this in your hand and your fingers will not close around it. A single tooth, longer than your palm, heavier than you expect, with a tip worn smooth from biting into something that fought back. It came out of a desert in Peru, a place so dry that years can pass between rains, and the animal it belonged to never once touched land. That tooth is one half of a story. The other half is the most famous predator the ocean has ever produced, a shark the size of a fishing boat. The two of them swam the same water, at the same time, chasing the same prey. One was a fish, one was a warm-blooded hunter with a brain, and somewhere in that shared sea, they crossed paths. People call this the most violent rivalry in prehistory. Here's the strange part. We have thousands of fossils from this lost ocean, and not one of them shows the two of them fighting. No locked jaws, no matching bite marks. So before we ask who won, we have to ask a harder question. Were they ever really enemies at all? And the answer starts in that desert. The desert is called the Ica, on the southern coast of Peru. Drive into it and the world empties out. No plants, no insects, just pale rock cracked by the sun, rolling toward the horizon in low waves, almost like the surface of the sea it used to be. Because that is what this place was. Millions of years ago, this ground lay at the bottom of a shallow, crowded ocean. When the animals living in it died, they sank into soft mud that sealed them away from the air. And air is what usually destroys a body before it can fossilize. So instead of rotting, they kept their shape. Whole skeletons, bones still joined together. In a few cases, even the faint ghost of skin. Paleontologists call a site this good a Lagerstätte, and there are only a handful of them on the entire planet. In November of 2008, a Dutch researcher named Klaas Post was walking this desert on the last day of a field trip. The trip was almost over, and half buried in the rock, he found teeth. Not shark teeth. These were enormous, deeply rooted, the kind that belong in a jaw built to crush. He had stumbled onto the skull of something nobody had ever seen. What he had found was not the shark. It was the other monster. And to understand why it mattered, we have to start with the one you already think you know. Everyone has a picture of the megalodon, a great white shark swollen to nightmare size, rising out of the dark with rows of serrated teeth. That image is on the movie posters and the book covers, and it may be wrong. Here is the problem. A shark's skeleton is not bone. It is cartilage, the same flexible stuff inside your ear and the tip of your nose. And cartilage almost never survives the millions of years it takes to fossilize. So when we say megalodon, what we usually mean is its teeth, hand-sized and triangular, scattered across the seabeds of the world in the thousands. From those teeth and a rare few preserved vertebrae, scientists have spent decades trying to rebuild an animal they have never once seen whole. For a long time, the method was simple. Take a great white, the closest living relative anyone could point to, and scale it up. That is where the boat-sized killer in your imagination comes from. Then in 2025, a team led by Kenshu Shimada took a different route. They worked from a stretch of fossil spine, and the proportions it pointed to did not match a giant great white at all. A body that stocky, at that size, would have been a nightmare to drag through water. The shape that made more sense was longer and leaner. teeth sheared past each other and tore a chunk clean out of whatever it was holding. The scientists who studied that skull describe its bite as the strongest of any four-limbed animal that has ever lived. Stronger than any dinosaur. Stronger than any crocodile or big cat that ever walked the earth. So now we have our two animals. A shark as long as two buses, and a whale that could bite through bone. They lived at the same moment, in the same water, and that is exactly where the trouble begins. To picture the ocean these two animals lived in, forget the open blue emptiness you might imagine. Off the coast of Peru, then as now, cold water rose from the deep and carried nutrients up toward the light. That upwelling fed clouds of plankton, the plankton fed fish, and the fish came in numbers that turned the water dark. Schools of sardines moved through it like smoke. It was one of the richest stretches of sea on the planet, and richness like that pulls in giants. But here's a detail that quietly changes everything. The whales these predators hunted were not the whales we know. Today, a baleen whale can run 90 feet and shrug off almost any attacker. In this ancient sea, most of them were small, some no bigger than a dolphin, slow swimmers with no real defense. For a hunter the size of a megalodon or a leviathan, that was a sea stocked with easy meals. Which means the two of them were not forced to fight over scraps. At least, not yet. And they were not alone up there. This is the part people tend to miss when they imagine a clean duel between two champions. The Miocene Ocean was crowded with killers. Leviathan had smaller relatives sharing the same water. Other raptorial sperm whales like Acrophyseter, a fraction of its size, but built on the same brutal blueprint, teeth made for tearing. There were other sharks. There were marine crocodiles. There were seals that hunted in the shallows and seabirds that hunted from above. The whole sea was a competition. So when we single out these two as the titans, it is not because they were the only hunters around. It is because they sat above everything else. Every other predator in that water was, at some size or some age, potential prey to them. They were the ceiling. And there were two of them. That is the setup. Two animals at the absolute top of a crowded ocean, eating from the same table. Everything about that arrangement says they must have collided. So where is the proof? This is the question that should be nagging at you, and it is the one paleontologists keep running into. We have, by now, thousands of fossils from this lost ocean. Whales by the hundreds. Sharks, dolphins, seals, the small prey and the large hunters, all preserved in that desert rock in extraordinary detail. And in all of it, there is not a single fossil that shows a megalodon and a leviathan fighting. No leviathan skull with a shark tooth buried in it. No megalodon vertebra scarred by a whale's bite. The most violent rivalry in prehistory has, so far, no recorded fight. That absence is uncomfortable, because a rivalry with no battle is just a story we are telling. So how do scientists claim there was a conflict at all? They do it the way a detective works a cold case with no witnesses. They read the evidence that is there. And it turns out you can read an was a mammal, and that single fact shaped everything about how they would have fought. Start with the shark. The megalodon was built around stealth and a single catastrophic strike. Sharks read the water through tiny pores in their skin that pick up the faint electric pulse of a beating heart, which means a megalodon could find prey it could not even see. Picture it rising from below, out of the dark, where its gray back blended into the deep. By the time anything noticed the shadow underneath it, the jaws were already closing. And those jaws did not need to be precise. One bite the size of a doorway, thousands of pounds of pressure, teeth that sheared through blubber and bone. And if a tooth broke off in the process, another was already growing to replace it. The megalodon fought the way an avalanche fights, all at once and from above. Now the whale. Leviathan did not have electric sense, and it did not need it, because it had something arguably more dangerous: a brain. In that great box of a skull sat the spermaceti organ, and like a modern sperm whale, Leviathan almost certainly used it to map the world in sound, firing out clicks and reading the echoes. It could find prey in murky water or total darkness, not by feeling a heartbeat, but by building a picture of it. And that forehead may have been a weapon in its own right. Some scientists think Leviathan could lower its head and ram, driving 50 tons of bone into a target like a battering ram swung in slow motion. Then there is the difference that may matter most. The megalodon, as far as we can tell, hunted alone. Leviathan was a whale, and whales tend to live in groups. We cannot prove it ran in pods, but if it did, the math of any fight changes completely. One megalodon against one adult Leviathan is a clash of equals. One megalodon against a coordinated family of them is not a fight. It is an ambush with the shark in the middle. So who wins? Here is the honest answer, and it is more interesting than a clean one. It depends on who you are looking at. A full-grown megalodon meeting a young Leviathan would have made short work of it. A full-grown Leviathan, especially with others beside it, could have driven off or killed a megalodon. And the young of both species were always at risk from the adults of the other. The roles flipped depending on size, age, and numbers. There was no permanent king and no permanent victim. On any given day in that ocean, the predator and the prey could trade places. That is what makes calling it a rivalry fair, and calling it a simple matchup wrong. But while we have been staring at these two circling each other, something else was happening in the water around them. Something that did not care which of them was stronger, and it killed them both. The ocean was changing. Toward the end of the Miocene, the planet began to cool. Ice spread at the poles, and as it did, the currents that moved heat and food through the sea started to shift and break apart. The warm, productive shallows that had fed this whole world began to shrink, and the small whales, the easy prey both giants had been built around, started to vanish. Think about what that means for an animal the size of a megalodon. A body that big is an enormous engine, and it has to be fed constantly. Take away the steady supply of slow, defenseless prey, and you have a hunter too large for the ocean it is left with. The same trap closed on Leviathan. Two predators perfectly engineered for a world that was disappearing underneath them. And new competition was rising into the gap. Faster hunters, the ancestors of today's dolphins and killer whales, smaller and quicker and able to thrive on the prey that remained.